Welcome everyone to NCEA's A Closer Look at the National Standards and Benchmarks for Effective Catholic Elementary and Secondary Schools Governance and Leadership webinar. My name is Kate Reich and I am the organizer for today's event. Before we begin the presentation, I hope you all have a copy of the standards that will be discussed this evening. I'm sending out a link to where you can access those standards, and we encourage you to visit that link and have them on hand as they will be referenced during this webinar. Please know that all of your microphone connections with today's webinar have been muted. During the presentation, you may ask questions or provide comments for the presenter by using the chat and/or question functions located in the Go To Webinar panel on the right side of your screen. To use these functions, click on the chat or question bubble and then click into the blank box area and enter your question using your keyboard. Then click Send. The webinar presentation will run for 45 to 50 minutes, leaving some time at the end for the presenter to answer any questions that you have provided. You will be asked to complete a brief evaluation about this webinar later today, and your feedback is greatly appreciated. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded, and you will all receive a copy of the final recorded presentation, which we will email to you once that recorded file is available. Now I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Lorraine Ozar, Director of the Andrew M. Greeley Center for Catholic Education at Loyola University Chicago. Dr. Ozar is today's webinar presenter, and I welcome her to our presentation.
Thank you, Kate. Good afternoon. I am delighted to be with you again. This is the third in our series of four webinars on taking a closer look at each of the domains in the standards and benchmarks. So today we'll be taking a closer look at Domain 2, Governance and Leadership. As Kate said, all right, now I have to get my, there we go, sorry. I am the director of the Greeley Center for Catholic Education in the School of Education at Loyola, and I am delighted to be with you today. Our goals for this webinar are similar to the previous two domains we looked at. We want to take some time to identify and explore the core concepts and expectations that are in Standards 5 and 6 and their benchmarks, look at key criteria that these standards call us to, these benchmarks call us to in terms of assessing school performance, and then as we go we will be talking about how these standards and benchmarks can affect school improvement. I will also be referencing some vocabulary in a new glossary that will be available online soon, and I will be referencing the rubrics available for the benchmarks in Standards 5 and 6, and then at the end talking about a few new tools that are becoming available. As we've said in each of our previous webinars, it's really important to keep the context that the standards and benchmarks really promote. It's one of the compelling pieces that Catholic identity for us in Catholic schools is present through all four of the domains. It's not just the purview of mission and Catholic identity. It is part of governance and leadership, academic excellence, and operational vitality. So Domain 2, Governance and Leadership, it's about authority, direction, and influence. Those who have authority exercise direction and influence in schools. And they do that in the three other domain areas: mission and Catholic identity, academic excellence, and operational vitality. So when we look at those who serve in a leadership and decision-making role on a governing body or a leadership team, they're doing three big things: setting the mission and vision and ensuring that it's really lived in the school community. They're creating a commitment to accountable academic excellence and establishing and securing the long-term plan for a vital and sustainable school. Mission and identity, academic excellence, operational vitality. The governing body, leadership team exercises oversight in all three of those areas. Now, we all know, I don't need to tell you, many of whom I'm sure are leaders in schools, perhaps members of governing boards, how important leadership is. Research tells us that leadership in a school, in fact, is second only to classroom instruction among all those factors that contribute to what students learn and how well. Our experience and the experience of many people working for school vitality and excellence is that schools with the best leadership are the ones most likely to survive, even in the toughest circumstances. When we look at the work of Eric Goldschmidt and Mary Walsh, their work on sustaining urban Catholic schools, in which they provide a description of innovative and new governance models, and I'll mention that in just a minute, some more of those, but they cite as among the key factors for success of any governance model is a bold, visionary leader and the possibility of real oversight. So we're looking at governance, Standard 5, and leadership, Standard 6. These two standards and their benchmarks address bold, visionary leadership and real oversight. You may, if you remember your philosophy classes, Aristotle and then later Aquinas talks about necessary and sufficient causes. I'd like to say that exceptional, visionary, entrepreneurial leadership is a necessary cause to achieve vibrant and sustainable schools. So leaders aren't the only cause. They can't do it alone. But without exceptional leadership in our Catholic schools, it's unlikely that they will be vibrant and sustainable. This area is so important. And then effective governance is the framework within which the leader works. So I want to say what you all know, and we're going to define some terms and talk about it a little bit more. There are different governance models. But standards 5 and 6 and the benchmarks that go with them identify the critical importance of both leadership and governance and their relationship. And they talk about what should be in place in a school with excellent leadership and strong governance, regardless of which model is operative. I want to make a really critical point. The kinds of work that effective boards do for the well-being and sustainability of the school related to those three areas, mission, academic excellence, and operational vitality, that work is the same kind of work, whether the board is authoritative, consultative, or advisory. Each of those kinds of boards has a different level of authority that attaches to the work, but the important work they need to do for the good and sustainability of the school is the same. And that's what's outlined in standards 5 and 6 and its benchmarks. So let's start with some terms. We are in the process of developing some guidelines for interpreting and scoring the rubrics that go with the benchmarks, all 70 of the benchmarks. And along with that, we're developing a glossary of key terms. Both of these resources will be available on the Catholic School Standards Project website, hopefully in November, certainly before Christmas. So the vocabulary, the terms I'm going to be defining as we go, these are the definitions that you will find on the web-based glossary that will be posted soon. So governance, broadly, a process that provides direction or authority for the well-being of the school. And again, we've got our key areas, mission and policy, establishing core priorities, and then often hiring, firing, evaluating key leadership. We could look at 4 large classifications of Catholic school governance, and you know these. Parish, a parish school, parish governance where the school is operated by a single parish, interparish, more than one parish involved, obviously, diocesan, and private. And for the most part, private Catholic school governance is part of congregationally sponsored schools. But we know that there are also beginning to be some schools that are governed by associations of the lay faithful, and so they would be falling into private as well. As I mentioned before, Catholic school governance, there are some emerging innovative models that Dr. Goldschmidt and Dr. Walsh have identified, and others as well. And you probably are aware of these. Diocesan centralization. You may have heard of the work that has been going on in Bridgeport and other places. Consortium schools, like the Catholic School Partnership Schools in Camden and other places. University partnership schools. Boston College sponsors St. Columkill. DePaul University in Chicago is sponsoring DePaul Academy, a high school in the Chicago area. There are regional schools where a region in a diocese would have the students come to a single school that served the whole region. A clustering of schools where there would be almost many districts that would be within a diocese. Private or lay-run schools, as we've talked about, and what some people call faith-inspired charter schools. And I know that's controversial. Some people believe that's a contradiction in terms, but there are people who are working to see whether there are ways to use a charter model and develop a faith-based school. So we'll see where that goes. But what this is saying is there are a number of models. But again, we'll go back to the key factors in all of them, the traditional ones, the innovative ones. Success is really entwined with having a strong leader and an excellent, well-functioning governing body. So let's look at governing body. It's the group that's empowered with a defined level of influence or authority to exercise oversight for what we've been talking about. Policies pertaining to planning, financial health, academic excellence, and mission fidelity. There can be 3 different levels of authority in a governing body. The highest level of authority in terms of having the most control over decisions is an authoritative board. And as the term suggests, it's a body that participates by actually formulating, adopting, enacting policy. This board, this kind of board, is given final authority regarding certain kinds of institutional operation. And other words, other names for an authoritative board is a board of limited or specified jurisdiction, a board of trustees, a board of directors. This kind of board is often seen in congregationally sponsored high schools, like, for instance, the Jesuit high schools. And often it would be part of a 2-tiered board structure where there is an owner board with some reserved powers, usually in regard to the mission of the school, property, and certain levels of financial encumbrance. And then a board of directors or trustees, the authoritative board, which would be responsible for hiring and evaluating the president or head of school, and would have the responsibility for determining the budget, for formulating policies, and so on. An advisory board which is the kind of board that most parish schools have. The boards are advisory to the principal and the pastor. This board participates by recommending policy to the person or persons with authority to enact it. The authority of whoever is the authority in a parish school, the pastor, principal, the authority is not bound by the board's advice. In a consultative board, it's very similar to the advisory board. That is, the person with the authority is not bound by the board's advice. But if the board is consultative, then the board must be consulted before a decision is made. So the principal or the pastor would be required to consult with the board before a decision was made. I want to say, and I'm sure it is part of your experience, that the level of authority that a board has, whether it's authoritative, consultative, or advisory, is not a measure of how involved or influential that board is. So a board may be very involved in decisions, even if the board's authority is mostly advisory or consultative. So if we think about how this might go in an example, a principal would go to the board, perhaps with a request to review the state of science labs in the school, to see whether, in fact, the science labs are not adequate to deliver the curriculum and the quality of learning and so on. The board would get the information, they would discuss it, they could contribute to the reasoning and the rationale and the strategies and so on, and then they would perhaps agree with the principal, and the principal would then take that recommendation or request to the parish or the diocese as the owner or the ultimate decision maker for permission to act. With input from a well-functioning board, the case for the recommendation, the request itself, it's likely to be much clearer, more insightful, more well thought out, perhaps including some implementation strategies and funding plans. It will be richer through the consultation of a well-functioning board. If the bylaws indicate that the principal must go to the board first with this kind of request, then it is a consultative board, and that would happen for sure. Or the principal may simply choose to do that because the decision will be stronger. The bottom line here is to engage in responsible oversight for the good of the students, for the mission. If everyone has done their job and understands their limitation, then things can move forward well, whatever the level of authority is. So it's important here to know that the standards and benchmarks are affirming the critical importance of a governing body with whatever level of authority working in good, strong relationship with the leadership team for the good of the school. Standard 5 then, which we're going to look at in more detail, is really about two big things. First of all, an excellent Catholic school has a governing body that understands its flow of legitimate authority. And then a well-functioning designated governing body collaborates with leadership to meet certain expectations. So that's what Standard 5 says. There is a board, there is a governing body, and it's going to collaborate with leadership on some very important things. So one of the things, of course, as a leader of a school, it is important to determine who is the governing body and what level of decision-making authority it has. But again, the work of that board is going to follow these benchmarks regardless of the level of decision-making authority. So Let me pause for a minute and see. I don't see any questions yet. Kate, are there any questions?
Not at this time, but if folks have any questions, please feel free to enter them and we'll address them some point throughout the webinar.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's look then at the benchmarks, the expectations for what a well-functioning governing body is going to do. Benchmark 5.1 talks about the governing body representing the diversity of stakeholders and functioning according to its bylaws. Representing the diversity of stakeholders. This would be gender, cultural, ethnic, also skill sets. What kind of skill sets would board members need to do the work that needs to be done for the school? The purpose of looking at diversity is in terms of having the right mix of people to do the important work, to engage the community, to collaborate, and then have the expertise you need to sustain an excellent, vibrant school. Having bylaws and a constitution make this work intentional and sustainable. And that's going to be a theme that runs through these benchmarks. People change in their positions, but the school in its mission and vision go on. So we want to be looking at what do we need to have in place so the school continues when principals change and board members change and teachers change and so on. The second benchmark is really very important. It's about policies. And one of the ways that you sustain continuity is by having policies, so that regardless of who the leader is expected to follow and maintain the policies. So this benchmark is about providing the structures and the framework for the school and everyone connected to it to sustain the mission and vision over time. A school operates. It does things based on the people who are empowered to make decisions or carry out responsibilities. But as I've said, the school goes on past this leader, past these board members, past this group of teachers and parents. Developing policies and procedures is the way we move beyond ad hoc individual actions to provide a framework and the parameters for action that the leader and all other decision makers are expected to follow. Policies describe how we do things here when we are true to our mission and successful. It's one of the most important responsibilities of the governing body to establish policies, to make sure they are communicated, to review them regularly, and to make sure everyone is held accountable for following them. I mean, think about what would happen in a school if we had a different process of admitting students or different criteria for admitting students every year. Or if a new principal could come in and completely change the grading scale or change it from year to year. Or if the financial officer was choosing to collect tuition from different families in different ways. You know how those experiences go. Policies help keep us focused on mission in a consistent, transparent, and just way. The third benchmark in Standard 5 is about the governing body in collaboration with or through the action of the leadership and leadership team, maintaining a relationship with the bishop. By canon law, as you know, the bishop is the ultimate legitimate authority over every school that can be called Catholic. The defining characteristics at the beginning of the national standards and benchmarks state that one of those defining characteristics is established by the expressed authority of the bishop. Now, this relationship with the bishop is closer, more penetrating, perhaps, in a parish or a diocesan school. But even with a private school, the bishop is the final authority in relation to church teachings, morals, and doctrine. And the bishop is the authority that grants that school the right to be a Catholic school in the diocese. As you know, and I'm sure you've heard us say often, these benchmarks are not minimalist. They're not the lowest common denominator. So the full statement of this benchmark talks about not only maintaining a relationship, but a relationship of mutual trust, close cooperation, and continuing dialogue, because that kind of relationship is going to be for the good of the school. Benchmark 4 in this standard talks about the governing body in collaboration with or through the action of the leadership team, maintaining a relationship with the diocese, with the Office of Catholic Education, in keeping with the status of recognition based on the governance model, parish, diocesan, private. Again, with a parish or diocesan school, there probably will be a closer connection to the diocese, to the Office of Catholic Schools, because there is greater requirement to follow diocesan policies and procedures. But this benchmark holds all schools to work at a productive relationship, which certainly can be beneficial to individual schools, but it might also be, and perhaps in some instances more important, to look at how the relationship helps provide a beneficial outcome for the community of schools. So I think sometimes there can be schools that have reached a level of excellence or effectiveness, and in certain areas that may feel that they don't have a lot to gain from working on something with the diocese. I would like to say that I think part of our solidarity with the church calls us to remember that we are church together. We are called to evangelization together, to care for souls together. And so the governing board and the leaders should hold themselves in the school accountable for maintaining a relationship that is part of their solidarity with the church. I think that's part of what this benchmark is calling Catholic schools to. Benchmark 5, the governing body with the leaders maintain a relationship with the parish, with the canonical administrator. This benchmark is really focused at, geared to parish or inter-parish schools. The governing body, in collaboration with the leadership team, maintains a relationship with the canonical administrator. In most cases, that would be the pastor. Like the relationship with the bishop, this relationship described in the benchmark is one of mutual trust, close cooperation, and continuing dialogue, so that the school can function well in regard to the 3 areas we keep mentioning: mission, academic excellence, and operational vitality. When the relationship between the governing body and leaders and the pastor, for instance, is inconsistent and unpredictable, it limits timely and effective decision making by the governing body, by the principal and leadership team, and by the pastor. So this benchmark sets the expectation that the governing body with the leadership takes responsibility for making this relationship work. developing shared goals that are productive, sustained, and focused on the future of the school. Finally, in Standard 5, Benchmark 5.6, the governing body and leaders engage in formation, ongoing training, and self-evaluation. This is for the governing body itself and also for the leaders. It's about accountability for performance and improvement. We expect our schools to be engaged in continuous improvement, academic excellence for students, and so the leaders and the governing body. The formation should be regular and intentional. They engage in processes and programs so that they can set goals with measurable outcomes, have follow-up, develop plans for improvement. The need for self-evaluation, formation, training is to ensure the faithful execution of responsibilities related to fidelity to mission, accountable academic excellence, and operational vitality, all for the purpose of sustaining a thriving school over time. And you can hear that theme running through. Thus, formation for the board and the leadership team, as we put forth in these standards and benchmarks, must include vision, must include mission, deepening understanding and orientation for mission, faith formation, best instructional practices, and best business practices. So I want to end Standard 5 about governance with this graphic. The role of the governing body should really be one of visioning, of looking out, of looking forward with the leaders, in collaboration with the leaders. There is, I think, when you look at both the importance of the governing body and the work we call them to do, there is an exhortation to think outside of just stabilizing what is now, being focused just on this year and then next year. Where does the school need to be in 2024? What kind of program? What kind of community will we have? What kind of students? What kind of space? What about the teachers? What will learning look like? And the leader needs to be a resource, a catalyst, a mentor with the board to be doing this visioning. People I know, and many of us who have worked with boards, with establishing and forming boards, would say that the reasons that governing body members leave often have to do with these kinds of things, that they have a sense that the leader has no clear, cohesive, organized plan, or the board is not being invited in on the big ideas, or there's no long-term strategic plan. The board wants to be engaged in meaningful work involved in what matters. And the standards and benchmarks, I think, really make it easier to maintain and engage effectively because we're not operating in a vacuum. The standards and benchmarks give us a clear picture of what's the important work to do. And then it's important to build the relationships, to maintain the relationship, board and leader, with the bishop, with the diocese, with other schools, to be looking out, visioning. Where does the school need to be long term? That's how we're going to be able to sustain ourselves. All right, do we have any questions at this point before we move to Standard 6?
There was one question, and it's a little, might need some more context to it, but to think about the role of these standards as related to the accreditation process.
Yes, I would probably need more
Humor.
more context for that because, as you know, the standards and benchmarks are being used for accreditation. They have been incorporated into the advanced ed process. They are being used by some of the Catholic conferences in Wisconsin, Ohio, Florida, a number of places where they are shaping their Catholic school accreditation processes using the standards and benchmarks. So of course they can, and I think having these standards and benchmarks about governance and leadership will be important in any accreditation process because from my experience having been in schools and been on visiting teams, when you're doing, especially if you're doing a public like a North Central or Middle States kind of an accreditation, no longer North Central, it's often the governance and leadership parameters that the visiting team does not understand because they're so different from public school governance. And having these standards and benchmarks could be a way, ought to be a way of being able to communicate more clearly with the visiting team what are the appropriate expectations and parameters and work for the governing body and the leadership team. So I hope that helps. I'm not sure what the full context is. Perhaps the person can context it more with you, Kate, and we'll come back to it.
Okay, thank you.
All right, let's move to Standard 6. Standard 6 is about leadership. And so in Standard 6, we're saying an excellent Catholic school has a qualified leader or leadership team whose job it is to realize and implement the school's mission and vision. Leaders carry it out. They are empowered by the governing body. So again, this relationship is so critical. The governance and leadership must be in critical relationship. Governance needs to collaborate with leadership. The leadership needs to carry out the delegated, charged responsibilities. You may have, if you were part of the webinar on operational vitality, you'll recognize this slide. When we look at the standards and benchmarks, we see that the leader and then the leadership team, supported by the leadership team, really needs to function in three big areas: a spiritual leader, academic leader, and really the CEO of a small to mid-size not-for-profit. And Patty Weitzel-O'Neill and Adam Kruikerberg in Operational Vitality talked about how these are three very different roles that require different skills, different talents, different approaches, and lots of time. So if we look at these three pieces that the standards and benchmarks really put onto the leader and the leadership team, we see that the spiritual leader aspect is addressed more specifically in the Mission Catholic Identity domain, the academic leader in the academic excellence domain, and the CEO part in operational vitality. What's happening here is that governance and leadership, this standard 6 says the leadership team engages in oversight of all three of those areas. You're not going to do it all individually, but you are going to have oversight. Again, an important role. So let's walk through the benchmarks in Standard 6. 6.1, leadership team is qualified to lead faith and instruction. This is about credentials, and not credentials for their own sake. Usually credentials are an indication of mastery of knowledge and skills and a commitment to continuous improvement. So this benchmark and its whole thing, and then when you look at the rubric, it's going to talk about not only the credentials, mastery of knowledge and skills, but a commitment to continuous improvement, as well as both and academic and faith leader. I really get upset by the implications that you run into so often in media, government, in debates on education, sort of the implication being anyone can do this job. Anyone can be a teacher. Anyone can be a school leader. This is a hard professional job, and we want to treat it like the profession it is. And for us, that profession has an academic and faith dimension to it. That's what this benchmark is calling us to. That's its expectation. Second benchmark in Standard 6, leadership team articulates a clear mission and vision, engages the school community to ensure a culture that embodies mission and vision. In the Mission Catholic Identity webinar, one of the questions I posed for reflection was, does your mission make your school community powerful in a single-minded purpose that means a lot to students, parents, faculty, staff, leaders, board? The leader and the leadership team are called to be the first guardians of mission. That's what this benchmark is about, to make sure that the mission is alive, well, important, real, making a difference for everybody. A powerful, powerful thing to be called to. The third benchmark in this standard is about the leader and leadership team taking responsibility for personnel. Huge. Development of personnel, formation, oversight. Finding the right people, providing for and expecting professional growth, expecting and supporting faith formation, assessing, and coaching. The defining characteristics, again, call Catholic schools to recruit teachers who can contribute to the school's Catholic identity and apostolic goals, to social justice, and to evangelization. We know that the quality of teaching a child receives has the greatest single impact on how much he or she learns. We know that 70 to 80% of schools' operating costs are people. So this is huge. This responsibility of the leadership team is huge. And again, it's the leadership team that safeguards and is accountable for all of this happening, for having the right people in the right jobs for the mission of the school. And this benchmark and its rubric makes it very clear it doesn't end with hiring. It's not about getting the right people and letting it go. There's no status quo about good performance. So it's development, formation, and oversight. In the fourth benchmark in this standard, leadership team supports networks of collaboration at all levels. This is tremendously important as well. It reinforces and operationalizes two big realities. First, from the defining characteristics again, the characteristic shaped by communion and community, Catholic schools place an emphasis on the school as an educational community of persons and a genuine community of faith. Community, academics, and faith. And second, the world works in teams. The way we learn, create new knowledge, solve problems, affect growth and change, it all happens in teams. So this benchmark is underscoring that the leadership team serves as the initiator, promoter, planner, and supporter of collaboration among all the school stakeholders. And they also provide them with clearly delineated goals, objectives, assessment protocols, and budgets to carry on their work. The leadership team ensures that things like the school schedule, their budget, school-wide goals and objectives support a culture of community and collaboration. The bottom line is Catholic schools are about collaboration and community, and the leadership team needs to make this happen. We all know intentions are always trumped by schedule, time, resources. So if you're going to make it happen, you have to organize the environment to make it happen. The fifth one, leadership team directs continuous improvement of curriculum and instruction, uses data to ensure continuing academic excellence and growth. Now this seems like a no-brainer. Of course, the leader and the leadership team are going to be about curriculum development, quality teaching, documenting continuing academic excellence and growth. But again, saying it's important and wanting it to be the case are much easier than making sure it happens for each student, for all students, and by all teachers. Anyone who has served as the leader in the Catholic school knows that while curriculum and instruction may be the highest priority, demanding our time and attention, it's also the most complex and therefore the most quickly set aside by pressing matters. You know, the fire marshal at the door, the angry parent, the current fundraising campaign. This benchmark holds our feet to the fire. Continuous improvement, not just good enough, good for now, better than our competitors. Continuous improvement. And we can't do that without understanding of and fluency with standards-based, backward design curriculum, articulation and coaching of research-based instructional strategies, and data, real learning results. A lot in this that the leaders are called to. 6, the team works with the governing body to provide an infrastructure of programs and services to ensure the operational vitality of the school. There's much more detail about what this work looks like in standards 11 to 13. But the point here is that the leadership team's job is to make sure there are programs, processes, and procedures, and the personnel to implement them so that the business side of the school works. Finances, human resources, facilities, technology, marketing, enrollment management, communications, advancement. Ideally, leader doesn't have to do it all personally, but the buck stops here in making sure it's done and done well, consistent with mission and vision. And then our last benchmark, 6-7. The leadership team communicates to all constituents. The responsibility for communicating new initiatives and changes to school programs, again, although it seems obvious, leaders can get so consumed by working things out and so familiar with what's happening as they're working things out that they forget to tell others. I know it's happened to me. It's probably happened to you. That others really have a need and a right to know, out of respect for the community, for partnership and collaboration, they have a right not only to be informed after the fact or as it happens, but to be prepared, consulted as appropriate, given the opportunity to assimilate the change, to process it and make sense. You know, as we work as leaders on changes, they become so familiar, and the reasons and the benefits and why this is good for students and the school becomes so apparent that when we simply announce it as a fait accompli, we haven't given people a chance to also see why this is such a good and powerful thing to do. So part of communication is to engage early and often and during in a way that really invites collaboration and partnership. And then to take those adages from the science of change, make it clear, make it easy, make it popular, and then make it mandatory. This benchmark calls the leaders in the leadership team to take into account all of the constituents who are going to be affected and take responsibility for bringing them along. So, pulling it together. I love this image because we know, and we here in Chicago have Moody and the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, so this looks really important to me here. But you need the conductor and you need the fabulous orchestra. So we need to have a great leader in a great team, looking at the fact these benchmarks, standards and benchmarks call us to be motivators and mentors and guardians of the product. Many would say that we in Catholic schools have a leadership crisis right now. Without effective leaders, no money, change in curriculum or facilities, fundraising is really going to be totally effective over the long run, both in terms of classroom leadership and school level leadership supported by a governing board, a governing body. You may know, if you've seen the announcements, that the first of NCEA's new priorities is LEAD. The standards and benchmarks provide the blueprint for what we are forming our leaders to do. I know we're close to the end, so I want to remind, and then we'll see if we have questions. If you go to the Catholic School Standards Project website, you will find under assessment tools all of the benchmark rubrics for these benchmarks. And if you haven't looked at them, I would urge you to look at them. They give you more details about what it means to fully meet or exceed or partially meet, do not meet these particular benchmarks I've been talking about. The rubrics look like this, and they suggest possible sources of evidence. So very important to use with your boards, with your teachers, in your schools for self-assessment. There is on the website now a new worksheet, a guided process for rubric scoring that is a 9-step process to work teams through taking any benchmark and taking some time to learn together and understand what it means, and then to systematically seek the evidence, to analyze that evidence, to draw some